Blog Talk Radio. Welcome to the Dark Matters radio show with the Sorceress Cagliastro, blood sorceress, pioneer, and necromancer in the hands of 9, for a discussion on all topics relating to blood sorcery, necromancy, the science of sorcery, and related work of manipulation of energy. Each week, the Sorceress Cagliastro and Chris Rogostrowski will explore topics designed to reveal what cannot be seen. Tonight's topic is sigils, and we'll discuss ways to work with sigils and also our new sigil lab. We also have a special guest joining us for part of the show, Victor Furman. Victor is an interfaith minister, spiritual channel, author, and paranormal investigator who is currently on 2 investigation teams in New York. Join us in the Dark Matters chat room. And now, here is the Sorceress Cagliastro and Chris Rogostrowski.
Thank you, Mary. Good evening. Hello, Chris. How are you this evening?
Oh, not bad. How are you doing, guys?
Good.
Hi.
Good. Chris, I just want to acknowledge once again that you've recently been through a family loss, and I want to acknowledge the commitment you had to that experience and to the assistance that you were to the disincarnate. And, going forward, I always make sure that I take a moment to honor both the living and the disincarnate in a situation like that. So thank you for that, Chris.
Oh, thank you. You didn't have to do that, but thank you again.
You're very welcome. Here we are tonight talking about sigils. And how does one talk about sigils on the radio? That's kind of interesting. When you read a book about sigils, the first thing people do is look to the illustrations. So what we're going to do tonight is make an effort to understand how they're used, what the potential is when you're involving yourself with sigils, and where they place in the sorcery. Sigils are essentially a mathematical equation. They are triggers to the human mind. If you draw a sigil and you leave it alone in the dark by itself and nobody sees it, it is not really the same kind of effective as it would be if you draw a sigil and enact it with your own experience of taking it in. It's like approaching a mathematical equation, all on its own, drawn on a board somewhere. It is really a powerless thing. It's a smudge of chalk. It's a nothing. But when you take it for what it can represent, and you allow it in, and you look at what it could be and say, well, this could bring us to a new evolution in some way, it can bring us some new information. I'm very interested in quantum physics, and I look at things like what numbers really mean and what they represent. And that sort of brings me to the understanding of sigils in this way. So tonight we're going to talk about what they are. We're going to talk about how they have come to be. And I want to talk about the myth that they must be thousands of years old for them to be useful. You can create a sigil in your mind and you can use it. Remember, I operate in the science of sorcery. The only entity that you have to worry about in terms of pleasing and making the right agreements with is yourself. So that being
unless
said,
you're married.
Unless you're married, yes, that's true. But going forward, as opposed to no divinities or deities of any kind. So, Chris, do you have anything you want to say? You have a Norse background, so I have a lot to say tonight about sigils and the new sigil lab, which we're opening in the Cagliastro studio in the hands of 9. But Chris comes to this with a history of understanding the Norse works in a way, and we'll talk about that. But Chris, do you want to jump in and talk about what sigils are to you and how you've experienced that work?
Well, I've always used, I shouldn't say always, but I like to use the runes from the older Futhark, which is the Norse version of the alphabet. I like using bind runes, and bind runes are really just another word for a sigil. I did get exposure to what a sigil is when I picked up a book by Peter J. Carroll in regards to his studies with chaos magic. And I thought, okay, well, I can incorporate what he's saying with this right here, and it makes sense. So most of my sigil work has to do, like I said, I use the Norse pattern because not only is their alphabet and its letters for words, all their letters have some kind of power to it. they represent something, where our letters are pretty stagnant. Their alphabet had meaning to it. You know, like one could mean strength, and one could mean domination, and one could be for protection, and one could represent mankind, one could represent the earth. And it's all things you got to figure, that I think about when I'm making the sigil. It's like, okay, I don't necessarily want to spell this word out, but I want to use these three right here because I'm looking for protection of my house and my family. Well, these three runes right here are the ones that do it the best. And that's how I make my sigils.
So when you work with sigils, you work with sigils that exist already and sigils that you're building through the rune stamps.
Right. That's how pretty much I do it. Now, I have done it when I've just let my mind wander and I've made something that, okay, this is going to represent so-and-so. If I'm trying to do something covert where I don't want people to understand what I'm doing, that if just by chance somebody would come across it, I mean, you could eventually figure out, it's like, oh, okay, well, these are runes. If you have any experience with any kind of paganism, you'll run into them. But if I'm doing something where I wanted to know what it means, but I don't want anybody else to know about it, I'll make something that's just mine. Now, I found... Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Finish what you're saying.
Now, I found something on the internet that it's the more or less the alphabet of what Lovecraft would use as far as Cthulhu and things like that. Who's going to break that down? You know, here's your perfect code that you can use and make a rune with. You'd be the only one that knows because you're the only one with the key that tells you what each symbol means.
Well, on the flip side of that, the idea that a rune, that a sigil means the same thing to everyone also has a certain type of power. People say to me all the time, well, what about the goetic sigils, the sigils of the demons of the Goetia? We talk about that all the time. We talk about what is a sigil. What is the fine line between iconography and sigils? People say to me, I have a friend who wears the Greek Orthodox cross all the time because he has a very different interpretation of that piece of art, if you will, and uses it as a sigil, essentially to cross over into the Haggalah, mattering on your point of view on the thing, into the Norse version of the angled center line, bringing one either into chaos or out of chaos, bringing one either into death or out of death. My own sigil is built with the base of the number 9 and the H sort of symbol from Haggalah and a number of additional lines expressing that I am more involved with the dead than the living. And if you look at it, you can see that that's what it is. When I built that sigil, I made a decision that that sigil would not only represent me, but the work of the Iron Ring, which is really the sort of umbrella over all of the type of science of sorcery that I do. So let's talk about sigils for a minute, that how energy hits them and what they do. In the studio, we're starting something called the Sigil Lab. And I had this idea that if sigils are truly triggers, which is what I perceive them to be, that's what the data shows me, then one would not have to know the purpose of the sigil for it to prove itself or make a connection to the individual. So in the Sigil Lab, what we will have is tables lining the side of a fabric-draped hallway, a very beautiful sort of sense of being in the folds of things. And one would walk through and put one's hands over the glass that the sigils would be underneath and allow sigils to speak to them. And it has a divination aspect in so much as it will show where people are, what they're looking for. And it also will have an extreme sorcery application. We'll take the sigils that jump out, we'll talk about what they are, and perhaps develop sorcery for people who are coming in there to have that experience. But sigils are like looking through a lens. When a light hits the lens, whether it reflects or refracts, mattering what side you're looking at, whether the light bounces off of it, whether the light is actually a beam of energy, all those variables come into play when you look at a sigil, because when your eyes take notice of these angles and these turns and twists, of these markings that are obscure and in and of themselves have no individual meaning, when all that comes together, something is triggered in your mind, and that is where the transaction takes place between this circle filled with squiggles and the desired outcome. Mary, you have any thoughts on that as we start to talk about how we're going to be working with sigils?
Yeah, I actually had a question from the chat room that I thought was very interesting that I wanted to bring up now since we're kind of doing an introduction to the sigils. But Darren had asked, do all sigils have to be drawn, or can they be made from other mediums such as sound or lights or something not as tangible as ink? And the reason why I bring that up is because I know with Reiki it's a symbol, it's not so much a sigil, but those don't have to be drawn in ink, or those don't have to be, on paper. You can work with them in the air, you can work with them in different ways. So I was curious to know if it's similar to like a symbol such as a Reiki symbol, or if it really is better being drawn in ink or, say, blood.
Well, every sigil has its own reason for being and therefore has its own application of how it can be transmitted. When I draw the sigils in ink, I do that so I can show them to people and say, here's the information. Ultimately, I would like to just project them on the wall through light. The highest and the high frequency of sorcery is when you draw them in your mind, and therefore they exist, and therefore they are usable. This goes all the way from one end to the other. Whether you want to carve them in stone, so you have a touch object that exists for a very long period of time and takes in energy and becomes crossing from that area of sigil into talismanic kind of sorcery, or whether you want to briefly scratch it into your skin and let it heal so that it pulls through it all the energy that it needs to and affects your life based on what sigil it is, or whether you want to see it in your mind's eye. The answer is that there are no absolute answers when it comes to this work, except to wrap your mind around the imagery in the sigil. So however that works and however it is best applied to the individual act of sorcery, and then that would really define that sort of thing. The answer is yes, 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 yes. Chris?
All right, well,
I've also...
Mary, were you going to say something?
I was going to say something. Yeah, I have a follow-up to that, but I'll let Chris answer. And I also wanted you to let everybody know Victor is here with us.
Oh, great. Hello, Victor.
Good evening. How are you?
Wow, Victor, you are a trooper. You're an amazing guy. Thank you for calling in tonight. I know you're having a night where everything is just fitting between two other things. So thank you.
I'm driving right now, and if someone cuts me off, I'm going to try to be respectful and refrain from using language that I might use when somebody cuts me off. So,
this is a good time for mental sigil imagery, Victor.
Actually, when Chris is finished, I do have a comment about sigils too.
Great.
Oh, go ahead. You're pressed for time, and I got the rest of the show to talk.
Victor,
well, basically, yes, I wanted to sort of answer that question that Mary had posed before from the person in the chat room. With my experience, starting in essence with Reiki, because I started getting involved in Reiki in the late 80s. And one of the things I noticed immediately was that I could feel the energy of the symbols if I raised my hand and put my hand across the symbols. So I was actually reading the energy. Then I found out something very interesting. If I took Chinese calligraphy, if I took Hebrew calligraphy, if I took any of the ancient languages and ran my hands across them, I felt similar energy. But each one had its own meaning, obviously. There's very subtle differences. But each of those languages, when drawn on paper, and I drew my hand across it, I definitely felt energy coming off of that. So I think there's tremendous power, obviously, in anything that's drawn with intention.
I know everybody wants to jump in on that, but Victor, let me just respond to that. First of all, absolutely. And second of all, 1,000 years ago, which isn't really 1,000 years ago, when they started the Kabbalah Center, which became the crazy thing that it is now, the sort of, ersatz celebrity wormhole that it is now. But when they started it was in a little house in Queens. And the birds were actually there, for whatever that's worth. People have their opinion about them one way or the other. But the books were there. They had the Zohar, the Kabbalah, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sefer Asriel. All those books were there. And you could touch them, and you could look at them and read them. And because they were based in a sect that was not as concerned with gender, everybody was free to read what they wanted to read in that environment. And, when you go into someone's house, you don't disrespect their custom. You could feel strongly and disagree with disrespect their custom. So I was there. A friend of mine who is still studying with them said, "Oh, you have to come and see this thing." And I wanted to see what their process was. So I went, and they handed me a Torah. And I said, "Well, I don't really partake in this." And they said, "No, just have the experience." And a fool passes the opportunity to have an experience. So I stepped in and allowed myself to broaden my gaze. And what they did was they opened the book and I said, "Well, I don't really read much Hebrew. I do read the Hebrew alphabet, but I don't really read." And they said, "No, just scan with your fingers. Doesn't matter if you know it or not, just scan." And Victor, that is exactly what happened. What I did was I started picking up the thoughts from everyone else in the room, because for me the connection was not one to their deity, but to the people in the room. And the more I scanned, the more I was hearing everybody thinking about their shopping list and getting home or loving what they were doing in the moment. So the letters themselves were creating some sort of energy in the room where people were able to pick up on each other's thoughts or feelings or being part of their experience. So absolutely, that absolutely is the situation. This is what I was saying before. What is the fine line between that which is iconography or now alphabet and sigils? Because the broader your gaze is, the more things you can put into sigils that will work for you as a person living in this time period and having the experiences that you're having, developing the sorcery that you need. Thoughts?
I agree 100% with that. I mean, you're the one that's empowering this stuff. Like you said about the connection with the Jewish writing and the people in the room. That's basically what you use a sigil for. It is a key to communication with whatever.
There's a great deal of imagery out there regarding what is old and ancient and what is very modern. And the idea of using technology and lasers and pushing light through things that had never had light pushed through them in that way before. And if you imagine some of the more ancient sigils or the rune staffs themselves reflected in this way and having technology pushed through them or offered to them in a way that they were not before, you can see that there is a timelessness. And when we do sorcery, one of the things that we involve ourselves in is the boxes, which is involves the moving of time or the moving of the process of what occurred in various times. So if you combine all the elements of sorcery and science of sorcery, and that's the thing I could speak on, and you put sigils in those boxes and move them around, you can change the past and the future in a very profound way by using the light, and by light I mean physical heat of energy, and pushing that into those sigils in a way that has not happened before. Anybody have any thoughts on that kind of idea of centuries of energy hitting things from a different perspective?
Well, very interesting. This will take a couple of minutes. It's a little bit of a story, but an interesting story. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a Kabbalist. And when I was a very young man, I think I had mentioned in a previous show that my first conscious experience of this incarnate being was my grandfather. And he related to me as though I were not a child, but someone who was a peer of his. And he used to point at the Torah and used to say to me that scroll contained everything that ever was or ever will be, but you need special eyes to read it. I said, "What do you mean special eyes?" He said, "You're going to need 64 pair of eyes." Now, at the time, you got to remember this is like 1957, 1958. And, I was a kid at the time. This had very little meaning for me. But I never forgot him saying that. Okay, jump back about 20 years ago or so. This mathematician and physicist from Russia by the name of Eliyahu Rips along with other Kabbalists who had been looking at the possibility that the Torah actually was a code for many, many years. And until 64-bit computer technology came along, they couldn't do anything with it. But jump about 10 years ago, you have 64-bit computer technology, and a book comes out called the Bible Code or the Torah Code. And guess what? They used 64-bit computer technology with arrays of the letters right out of the Torah, not rearranging them or just taking them in 64-bit arrays, and they started getting what we would consider to be prophecy, but you'd have to know what to look for. But 64 pair of eyes, that's exactly what my grandfather was talking about.
Wow. So when that happened, Victor, what was your experience in that moment when you saw that? Because I am very familiar with the Bible Code and the Bible Code Revisited, both of those books. So what was your experience? What did you think was occurring when a man in the 1950s was telling you this and that was happening?
It was a recognition that he had an understanding on a much deeper, much more profound level than most people did until the science came around and provided the ability to do the coding work, to do the mathematics. And, he used to talk to me about the Hebrew letters being very special, the block Hebrew, what's called the biblical Hebrew or traditional Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, not the current modern Hebrew writing. Right. He used to refer to them as flame letters, that there was